Hello everyone, welcome to CodeRageXI. My name is Ray Konopka with Raize Software, and today I'm introducing Radiant Shapes. Radiant Shapes is a library of 35 reusable FMX controls, all based around shapes. They're highly efficient, very flexible, and of course, easy to use. They're useful in all aspects of your user interface development, from style composition to adorning buttons to represent certain icon images to visualizing data in new and unique ways, and even dashboard design. There's lots of demos that I'll be showing in this course that give us a better idea of just how flexible these shape controls can be. As a FMX library, it supports all of the platforms that FMX currently supports, so that includes Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android. And what really sets this library apart are the component designers that are included, which make manipulating the different shapes, getting the look and feel that you're looking for that much easier. In designing the shape controls, there were a couple core principles that were used to direct the development. First and foremost was to provide the best possible visualization regardless of the device. And what that means is because there's so many different device types out there and at different resolutions and DPI settings. So we've got traditional desktops that we're still writing software for, plus high-res desktops in Mac OS and in Windows 10, for example, and then add in all of the mobile devices that we have, and whether that's phone or tablet. The key principle in developing Radiant Shapes was to maintain the appearance of all the shapes and their fidelity regardless of how the shape is scaled or sized. And so this is very much like having a vector library. So regardless of what your output is, you can scale and shape the shape to be what you want. So Radiant Shapes was developed originally by Raize Software, and in 2015 was acquired by Embarcadero Technologies. Since then, in this past summer, Embarcadero made Radiant Shapes available for all users of RAD Studio 10.1 Berlin as part of the Berlin bonus pack. So if you are interested in getting Radiant Shapes, if you haven't already done so, you can do so, and I highly recommend it since it's available to every Berlin user, is go to embarcadero.com/rad offer. If you go to the bottom of the page, you'll see bonus pack redemption, and look for Konopka Radiant Shapes. That's to make it similar to Konopka Signature VCL Controls, but you want the one for Radiant Shapes because that's what this session's about. That will take you to a page where you enter in your Berlin serial number, and then once you submit the form, you'll receive via email a serial number for installing Radiant Shapes. Once you have that, go into RAD Studio 10.1 Berlin, go to the Get It Package Manager, and I simply recommend searching for Radiant. That's the quickest way to find it. Once you do, click on Install and follow the installation prompts. Once you've done so, you'll have Radiant Shapes installed inside of your version of Berlin. That's all the slides that I'm going to have, except for the final slide. But for now, I'm going to switch over into RAD Studio, and we're going to take a look at just how these shape controls can be used. And here we have RAD Studio 10.1 Berlin, and I have a Firemonkey form, just a plain old form up, and I have on my component palette all the way down at the bottom, because I just recently installed them, I have all the Radiant Shape controls. And for the first part, I want to essentially highlight. A lot of these are pretty straightforward. You understand how they work or what they are just by their shape and their icon, which is great. But really what I want to highlight is some of the capabilities that each of the controls represent. So to start, I'm going to put down a line component. And it's what you would expect a control to do, but it goes a little bit beyond that to make it a little bit more flexible. So there's a line slope property. So we can control whether or not this is a positive, negative slope to get that angle that you're looking for, or maybe no slope. If you wanted to create a horizontal line, it's very easy to do so, and you can change the various thicknesses of the stroke that's used by going in, changing the font thickness. Very easy way to do different lines and elements there, and so we can change these all by using the component editors. I can make that vertical, of course, and it's centered inside of the display. That's one of the things that drives these shapes, is that they're usually used in concert with other shapes to composite and build things together, so we want them to be easily positioned and managed. But let me go back to the regular line, and let's go ahead and add some arrows. You can do start and finish. There's actually, depends on how that's set up in how you define it. That determines which end you're using, or we can do it on both. And as I already showed, how we can change the length of the stroke size I mentioned is what I could change. I can change that to say 5, go back in, change the arrow length to say 30, a little bit more pronounced, and go even and change the alignment to be clients. There's a lot more align options in FMX versus VCL, so that's what all these represent. But really what I wanted to get at here was to change this up a little bit. And what we'll find is if we go ahead and resize the form, you'll note that the arrowheads actually all stay within the contents of the bounding rectangle of the shape. And that's one of the design principles that was very important in developing these. And that is that if you start to animate and you want to move things around, and if you exceed the bounds of your controls, which normally would happen if I were to make this smaller and those arrow edges would go out, well, those can leave remnants or artifacts on your form as you move them around. And that obviously is undesirable and can make your application look pretty poor. The Radiant Shapes knows all the dimensions of the shapes and how it's built based on the stroke size, so that it's very effective and easy to do. So let me take off the line there and take a look at some of the other controls. Obviously the rectangle is a standard rectangle, has all the same pieces. The three common ones that we have is we have our alignment, the fill, which is all the standard fills, so we can do a gradient fill, for example. You can also change the stroke and the stroke thickness, so we can make that really thick if we needed to have that kind of effect. Let me change this back to solid, and you can get a feel for how that looks. You can even go more of a dots. So just a lot of flexibility in those places. We can even do some corners for each of these, and that's based on you have your corner type, and then whether or not you have the corners, and then the radius that's used for those. So we can put in, say, a 20 and a 20, and you get the effect. Let me change that down to something a little bit smaller, and then you get the effect of each of those. So inner round, and even change it to inner line. So some cool things that we can do beyond just the regular rectangle that you get in the standard FMX rectangle control. The shape is kind of neat, square I mean, simply because it's very easy to position. And so it's based and constrained based on the shortest dimension. And so this is really effective when you're trying to composite things. What I mean by that is you're going to assemble 2 or more of the shape controls to get an effect that you're looking for, and we'll see some examples of that a little bit later. Next up, I want to spend a few minutes to talk about what is called a radiant dimension. And what that is, if we drop both the ring and the frame down, and let me resize these to make these look a little bit bigger, what we'll see is the radiant dimension capabilities in effect right away. And that is if you notice the thickness of this frame and the thickness of the ring, as I resize it, proportionally it looks to be the same relative to the whole frame as I get it smaller and smaller. And that is driven by the frame size property, which is a radiant dimension. And that means it can be handled in 2 different ways. One, it can be, the default is a scale factor. And this is part of that design to have fidelity as we scale and change the size of our controls. And so by default, for the frame, it's set up to be 20% the size of the container, of the frame itself. And so if we want to make that thicker, we can go ahead and change that to 0.3, and as I resize it, it still has that same relative view. Of course, I can do the same thing for the ring size and go ahead and make that even smaller. We can change that down to be a very tiny ring, and so no matter how I bring that down, it changes. Go back into the ring size, make it maybe a quarter, looks good. What's nice though is that the radiant dimensions allows you to specify a pixel value. So maybe you don't want to scale it where you always want it to be a certain pixel size, say 20 pixels, then no matter how big you make that frame, that is the dimensions that it uses for that size. Another thing to note is that these are fully transparent, and so when I were to do a fill on this, the fill is actually in the interior of the ring, and of course the stroke on the outside can also manage. You can change that as well, as we've seen. The stretch is, if I were to go and change the dimensions, normally it handles like a circle, kind of like the square we did, but if I stretch it, it stretches it out to fill up the remaining bounding rectangle. So you have a couple different options to work with that. Turn off the stretch and it's constrained by the smallest dimension. All right, let's take a look at some of the other ones. The circle ups, the capsule is kind of an interesting one, simply because it's a very common use for or a button shape. And so you could use this to create the backing of a button very easily. What's nice in Firemonkey, if you were to drop a label and let's put that in the capsule itself, so it's owned by the capsule, and you could position your label where you wanted it. Now when you move the capsule around, the label is associated with it, and so it will also stay with it. So kind of neat to be able to take a look at that. And that's some ability of the shapes, radiant shapes, and the Firemonkey capabilities. Let's take a look at the sector and the sector ring. And they're very similar. And what they do is obviously display like a pie shape. The interesting point is that it is driven by the center point of the bounding rectangle that we have, and it is always in a circle. What's interesting though is if we look at the start angle, and the start angle for this shape is at 270, and that's because the horizontal line here is actually angle of 0, but it goes positive in the clockwise direction. If you're a math major, that's very opposite. Typically the positive is going counterclockwise. So for this particular angle, we have it starting at 270 and then going for 90. Let's change the central angle to be, say, 45, and that'll give us a different look. If we go and change the start angle to 0, we see that it starts here. And what often we get questions on, why is there a start angle and not an end angle? What's the point of having the central angle? Well, one of the values of doing that is that if I need to change the angle of this, I just worry about the start angle and I don't have to worry about what the corresponding end angle is. I always specify what the central angle will be. Where that's really useful is if we wanted to do something like animate this particular shape. And we can do that quite easily. If we take the look at the component and go over to the start angle, we see that there is a little movie strip next to that property value, and that means that we can animate it. And so we can go ahead and create a new float animation, and we can see that our radiant sector now has a float animation associated with it, and we're going to animate over the start angle. So let's animate, let's start it from 0, which it currently is, and change that all the way to 360. Go all the way around. And let's loop it so that we don't stop. And let's make it take a little bit longer. So we'll make it go 2 seconds instead of 0.2 seconds. And we're good to go. What I'll do next, let's turn it on in our checkbox here. And I've already typed in the code to do that, and we have if it is checked, go ahead and start the animation. If not, stop it. So let's go back to our form and give this a little run, and what we'll see when we check it is that we now are animating the shape. Kind of looks like a little sonar detector. Throw some alpha color values in there to see some transparency. You can have a really cool effect for showing something taking a long time. You know, you can be very creative in how that looks. Go ahead and stop it. Snaps back to our value. The sector ring is done very similarly. I should point out that obviously this could be used for creating a pie chart, set up a bunch of different pie pieces and set up their angles. You're good to go. This is a sector ring where you specify the interior opening as well as the ring part like we saw previously. And then our start angle is 210, which is this angle, and the central angle is actually 120. If we make that 180, and we go and change our start angle to 180, now we have a semi-sphere almost looks like a gauge, and actually have some examples later on where we do use this as a faceplate for indeed a gauge, where we have a little line indicator that we can create. Again, another capability of compositing the various controls to get the effect that we're looking for. Okay, a few more things. Let me close, get rid of these, and we'll take a look at, say, the triangle. Triangle's nice. It's amazing how frequently triangles are used. Just look in the IDE for RAD Studio. We've got them in for debugging and playing, and then we use them for navigation. Throw another rectangle. We'll change the direction here to be right, and put a rectangle at the end, and you've got an indicator for going to the last record in a database. So a lot of different capabilities that we have there. For our triangles, you can have a right triangle and throw it to different corners. So put it in the top right, for example. Of course, it's all scalable. If you want to change it back to your isosceles, you can go ahead and do that. Go ahead and go to your stroke size, change that to like 8, and then you'll note that the full point of this is inside the bounding rectangles. And this is important because there's a path component that is included with the FMX base classes. It's under the regular shapes tab in the component palette. It's powerful. However, it does suffer the problems that if you use a stroke thickness that is beyond 1, so anything larger than 1, the extra thickness goes beyond the bounds of the controls. And so if I were to rotate this like I did the sector from before, anything that would be outside of the bounding rectangles would get clipped and be left on the form when you were doing that. It's not what you want. And so Radiant Shapes is efficient enough and designed so that doesn't happen, regardless of how you set up the various controls, stroke and properties and so forth. Other controls, so a lot of the standard shapes. I'm not going to go into a ton of details for all of these. They're pretty straightforward with respect to what capabilities you can get. I've actually used this quite a bit, the trapezoid, for changing various angles, using them for pointers and things like that. Same thing with the parallelogram, the pentagram, and the hexagon and octagon, standard shapes. What's nice and one thing to remember about these is that because they are Radiant or Firemonkey shapes, they have all the standard properties of an FMX control. And so we can go into a rotation angle here, and if we don't want the horizontal arrangement of this and we want it to be vertical, you can just change the rotation and get the effect that you want. Let me clear up some of these, and we'll drop down these 4 arrow controls, because arrows again are one of those things that we use quite frequently in our interfaces. You can see them, they're used up in here. They've got arrows assigned in all of these. Again, when we're talking about scaling and providing fancier user interfaces, having a vector-based arrow capability is quite powerful. I can go ahead and select all of these and go to the direction property and change them all to be right, for example. They're all specified in that same way. Of course, the other properties are there for me to change. And so it's really nice to be able to affect that capability. And so make my chevron a little bit bigger there. And you can kind of get the effect that you're looking for just by playing around with the various sizes. And then even the arrows, the dimensions and things that we can run with, you can change and scale. You can change the tail length and tail width are also available here, so you can get different styles and settings that you're looking for. Next set of controls, whether or not you're using it for a calculator or some sort of spreadsheet type of interface. It is quite interesting how all these can find uses inside of our apps. And one of the things that you'll note is that they're all set up to be the default size, and they all look to be about the same thickness. And that's because they have a shared property called bar size. And that, again, another radiant dimension that is set up to control how thick in each of these controls are. And so if you have them either overlaid or set up to be the same size, and you go into the bar size and set your scale factor, say to 0.4, they're going to look really thick, or 0.1, make them really thin. It can all be controlled, and so that they have the same balance that you would use. So pretty straightforward there. The next set we have here are similar. They're identifiers, markers, tags, what you would like to call them. Good if you have like mapping software or you want to showcase some sort of location. You can have the, of course, change the directions just like you would for the arrows. We can go and change whether or not we have the whole size in there, just hide it completely, or have it visible, and of course change the dimensions. We can make that look a little bigger because it's the whole size, not the ring size. So go ahead and make that a little bigger like that. Our banner can be either looking like a bookmark or a chevron. Kind of depends on what effect you're looking for. And the tag has the same thing, looking like the marker. So show the whole and the whole size as appropriate. So just nice little indicators to give you some added capabilities. The star, if you're looking for a star to highlight something, the default is to do a 5-pointed star, but you can change that to whatever you want. You go 9-point. Well, that looks kind of odd until you change the radius scale factor. So you want the radius of those to be much smaller. Go ahead and change this all the way up to 20, and you get a nice little star burst that you have set in your application. Go ahead and change your stroke size if you want to give it a little bit boldness, and color. Go right ahead. The call out, another way if you wanted to do some sort of pop-up hints or some sort of indicator. There's a lot of customization that goes with this. If you go and change the alignment, so give it inside, where do you want the call out to be? So it could be centered, could be trailing, and then you can put it on any of the different sides. So put it on the right side, and it adjusts everything appropriately. The gear is very much like the star. So it's set up to be cogs, and we can go in and change how many we have into the gear. So it's kind of fun. Again, you can use it for configuration or some other purpose that you might find useful. I've got a couple examples of that I show a little bit later on. We can change our whole size to be quite big, maybe not quite that big. There you go. And get a lot of fun with altering the different properties, and the same thing with the cog size. We'll make that a little bit thinner, and you can get a good little effect. The last control is the shield, and this is one of, it kind of illustrates the future potential of what can be done with radiant shapes, because each of the shields are driven by a path, and the framework that Radiant Shapes provides allows us to essentially take any path that we deem that we want as a reusable shape and simply add it in. And because this, for example, shows us a whole bunch of different pre-designed shields that we can use for iconography, to put it into a button to indicate security steps, whatever is desired, we can go ahead and use that. And it's just really simple to pick and choose the various styles that are inside of this component. So root, interstate, and then finally the root indicator that's there. So a lot of capabilities here. But next up, I want to focus on using these components in applications to really get some cool user interface effects. So here we have RAD Studio 10.1 Berlin, and I've loaded up the demos project that is included with Radiant Shape. And there's several projects inside of it, and we're going to walk through each of them because they each demonstrate various shape controls and in some different ways that they can be used to enhance your user interface. And of course, with the X, the X and the ring, it made perfect sense that I had to create a tic-tac-toe game, and this really leverages the layout capabilities of Firemonkey. And so it uses a grid panel layout to set up the 9 grid cells that are needed, and in each one we have another layout, and each layout contains either a radiant ring or a radiant X. And so all the application does is it detects mouse clicks in each of the layouts, and if it gets, depending on the turn, it either puts an X, makes that visible, or makes the O visible, and then determines after each move whether or not someone's won. So really the setup is pretty straightforward, not a whole lot of code other than to check that a winner was won, and turning on the different shapes. So let me go ahead and run this, and it will illustrate some interesting things. This control that I didn't talk about in the back, if you haven't used FMX much, this is a style book, and so I've loaded up the style that gives us this background. So that's actually coming from the style, and then I just put up an alpha blend on each of the lines so that it looks, you can see a little bit of the background through it, and go ahead and start by just clicking a square, and I get one of the X's that shows up. And I can go back and click an O, and we'll go back, click another X, and the O is going to be kind of silly, thinking that he's going to do something fun, and we're going to put him into trouble, and sure enough, X wins. And what's interesting about this is that as I resize the control, we can see that the shapes themselves keep their same relative positioning. Even the stroke thickness gets scaled. That's built into the component. There's a scale stroke thickness property that you can turn on or off. And it really keeps the fidelity of this. No matter what display form factor I'm running this little game on, I know that it's going to look good. It's going to look crisp. I'm not going to get rasterized artifacts if I'm using images, even PNG images with alpha blending to get that. I'm just using these shapes to do that, because you can notice they're translucent, so it's not a solid color. You can actually see the background through them. It's a really nice way of managing the control. And of course, start up your new games and just have fun clicking around. And I don't think I did get my old diagonal in there. So that's the tic-tac-toe game. Let's move on to the next example, which is a flowchart. I just need to clarify that while there are a lot of shapes in Radiant Shapes that look like flowchart symbols, so you've got diamonds and parallelograms and capsule buttons and so forth, there's nothing built into Radiant Shapes to snap things together or connect them like you might think in a flowchart, but you can certainly use them to do some diagramming. And in this particular example, I've just laid this out using the lines and the arrowheads and the various shape elements and putting text in each of the shapes. They're just separate label controls. We can see that by looking at each of the different pieces. Open that up and there's a text element that's inside of there. What is kind of neat is that the scaling capabilities of Firemonkey are pretty powerful. And so as I resize this form, I'm programmatically resizing the font size so that the text labels get bigger, but it keeps the relative position of everything. And so the shape controls give us a nice capability to see that. The next example is the Radiant playlist. And this I need to provide a little bit of extra information, and that is that this is based on the list view control, and the Firemonkey list view has seen some enhancements over the years. The most recent one actually is in Berlin, where they added the ability to do the native rendering on iOS, and there's an adapter functionality so that you can alter and control the display of the individual elements much more. There's a lot more flexibility in that. The reason I mention that is that if you download through the bonus pack Radiant Shapes and you install it and you try to run this demo on your instance of Berlin, you will get an error. It will fail. That's because of some of these changes. Now, I have since updated that, and I have a link that I will include at the end of the presentation where you can download the source for the new demo. But before going into more details, let me go ahead and run this so that we can actually see what this application does. And you can see that there's a client data set, and the client data set is storing a bunch of songs. So I have the song title and the artist, and then I've added in the ability to have a ratings. And so each song can have a rating, and to manipulate this, these are radiant stars, and I just click on them. And so I can change each of the settings. I can double click an item to clear them all out, and anything that I click, that's what I get. And so what's nice is it's keeping track of that. When I go ahead and close it, it's persisted it to an XML file, and when I load it back up, I get my same data that comes back into the display. And what's nice is that it's very fast because the list view is much faster. I did this years ago, a similar type of control using the list box, which was horrendous. But everything is nice and functional here, even the selection of the items. Each individual shape is actually translucent if it's disabled. And what's really nice, because these are shapes and not images, I can change the size very easily. I can also change the coloring that's used for those very easily. So this, I do want to spend a minute to talk about how that was structured, since there isn't a whole lot at the design time element. It's more programmatic, and we're going to take a look at how this was set up. The list view itself, let's look at the form, and what it does is it has this load playlist, which simply iterates through the client data set. Again, a little contrived, but really it's not the data set that's the important piece, it's the shapes. And we create a new item that we're going to add. So very collection-like approach here. So we ask the list view to give us a new item, which is a list view item, and then we set up the properties, the text, details, and accessories. The accessories needed in Berlin to tell the item that there's more information to display. And then we use the tag to hold the current rating of that particular item. What was a little different, or what was different, is previous versions we could actually create the rating stars right after we created the item. Unfortunately, that doesn't work if you try to load it when your application starts. So in this case, the alternate way, or the better way to do it in Berlin, is to handle the list view's update objects event. And this will give us a point. It says for each item that was added, we get an event to let us know, hey, do we want to modify or update any of the objects that are in the list item? And a list item has elements, if you will, sub-items that are used to display the content. So you have a text element, a list item text, for displaying the item's text. Then you have another one that displays the details. You might have some glyphs that are used to show an icon. You might have some buttons to show a more or an edit. Fortunately, we're going to use a specialized version to put our rating stars in it. So what we're doing is when we ever get the update objects for this particular item, we go ahead and create an instance of this list item rating stars. And we just give it a name, we set up the rating based on what the item's tag is, and then go ahead and set up a change handler so that if the rating stars change, means its value 1 through 5 or gets cleared out, we can be notified at the main form, and then we'll save that off into our client data set. So what is this list items rating stars? Well, that's defined up here. Let me go back up to the interface for it. And it is a T list item embedded control. And this is a way that we can embed other components inside of this list item. And all this is doing is actually creating a set of 5 radiant stars. And if we go down to the constructor for this, we see that that's exactly what happens. and those 5 stars are positioned next to one another. They all have a size of 30/30, and that makes sense because the list item rating stars itself it's 125 by 30, and we're setting the alignment so that it's at the right, the trailing edge of the item, and it's vertically centered. And so this takes care of positioning it where we want it to be. And if we scroll down further, we can see that each star has its on click event that's mapped to the star clicked event handler. And so this is when we make a change inside the rating stars, it lets the item know that something was changed, which lets the list view know that something was changed, and it connects it all together. And so the rest of this is really just changing the, if the rating gets changed, we have to update the various colors for each of the items, clear them out if they don't, and then if we do have a change, we simply invoke whatever event handler is connected to it. And if we're going to click one of the stars, we change the rating. This is the property of Raize. So set rating is actually going to get called in this case. So pretty cool way to manage that. And if I go ahead and run that again, that alignment comes into play as I resize this. So it always stays on the right edge where you would like it to be. Okay, let's move on to the next example, and that is our media player. And the media player is an example of, there's media player samples in the FMX samples directory. This one's based on the same principle. It's using the Team Media player to play a video. But I wanted to make the interface a little bit more fanciful, a little bit more modern. So it's got the dark look. All these, I'm using shapes for the various commands, almost as icons for me to click on. And it's set up pretty interestingly. If we look at clicking on any one of these particular things, we've got the buttons on the left and the right, and then the playback buttons. They're layouts that are positioned to be in the main button bar, and each one is set up essentially as a composite of various shapes. So the eject open is got a triangle and a rectangle to represent that. Same thing with our power. It's using the sector as well as a rectangle. And there's glow effects on each one. So the other aspect of this is that these shapes, normally when you were to click on, say, this shape, the shape itself would get the mouse click event and nothing would happen. But I want everything to be off of the eject open button, for example. The on click is there. So the way that works is that there's a hit test property on Firemonkey controls that we can turn off, which tells that particular control to ignore any mouse clicks, mouse events on it, and pass it to the parent, which is this layout. So let me go ahead and run this application, and we'll get to see how this looks as we move. So we can see that there's a color, that's one of the default colorings, and there's a glow effect as I move my mouse over each of these images. And if I go ahead and resize the form, this is what's one of the nice things in Firemonkey is the center alignment. So this playback panel is always centered in my content area. Let me go ahead and open up a video. We'll pick one, close this down, and I can resize my app a little bit, go ahead and play, and we see the video that's played. I can adjust the volume using the little volume indicator here. I'm using the marker to show progress in the display. Go ahead and click pause and get a look for it. So I'm using each of the shapes to get the effect I want. What's kind of neat is that if you go into the configuration, you can change the coloring that's used for the buttons. And so the glow effect changes, the button colors change. I can go in and change from some pre-canned values to get a look. Now I could do that in images that I were to use, but what really gets difficult or fun is when you start using custom. And so if I change this to make this, say, a brighter orange color, and this one will make it a little bit deeper. Go ahead and click OK for those, and now I've really customized to the user's liking what interface elements I want to use for this display. Okay, couple more demos next. Next up is radiant gauges. And this is an example where I've taken several of the different shape controls and assembled them into a visual gauge. Some can have tick marks, some can have color shadings. As you can kind of feel, there's the various shapes that are used. Here's the sector ring that's serving as the face plate for the first grid. There's a circle background that's used for the gradient fill to give that background. This is a trapezoid that's used for the needle. Each of these can be rotated based on what I showed before, being able to rotate controls. So we have that ability in each of these gauges. So I can build up trapezoid for the ring, sectors for the fill. So this one sector is the frame around the three other ones, and they're partitioned off just using the same techniques we showed earlier. So start angle and what the central angle is. The third grid gauge here is actually using a fill, uses a sector ring on the outside, gradient fill, and a interior texture fill. And the final grid over here is using the marker, just without the hole in the middle of it. Of course, you could add it in if you wanted. What's fun with each of these, though, is that I can change the angles for each of these. And if we look at the code real quick behind these, there isn't a whole lot that's there. We're simply changing the needle's rotation angle based on the track bar gauge. And then there's an animation option as well that I'll show in just a second. So let me go ahead and run this. And I did not code it to where I would move the gauge itself. Typically a gauge is driven by background processing, so the track bar moves and the gauge changes, and it can rotate to any position that's necessary, and gives us a lot of visual feedback as to what the setting is. And of course the real fun is when you start to animate it utilizing the animation engine that's built into Firemonkey. So very cool way to get some extra visualization just by utilizing shapes. I had mentioned dashboards earlier in the discussion about a visual way of representing information about a system. Industrial engineering and manufacturing processes, things like that, are constantly having to convey state and status to users. And the shape controls can be very effective in providing a very visually catching, distinctive look. Here's an example of a network status, kind of fictional, but yeah, it's based on some real concepts that I've worked on. Centralized processing for managing various nodes in a network, dispensers, if you will, and controllers. And as network traffic goes through, you want to make sure that everything's working fine. And there's various errors and things that can occur, and then having some sort of indicator letting us know the current status of the system. And one of the techniques that I used here is to lay out the various controls that I was using in a layout, and then I made a copy of the layout which copied everything inside of it, and I just rotated the layout 120 degrees to give me C and B. So it worked out really well to create those. And of course the fun is in the simulation, so let me go ahead and start this up, and we'll position this somewhere in the middle here and start our simulator. And we can see that there's some network traffic going on, and we're seeing the different statuses, and then all of a sudden there's an error condition. And again, I'm animating some chevrons using various shapes. Just a very interesting way of conveying information. Go ahead and start that up, and it goes back and works. So this gives you an idea of some ways to think about using shapes and Firemonkey to convey information in different ways. And the final demonstration program has to do with gears. if you're going to make a gear, you have to make it move. That was just my thinking, so I needed one to fun one to wrap this up, and laid out all the different gears, connected them, set up their cog sizes and then the radius of each one of them, and went through, and we go ahead and start this up and go ahead and click animate the gears, and they start to move. And again, not real practical, but it was a lot of fun, and it looks kind of mesmerizing having all the connections in there. And these are just, again, Firemonkey shape controls, animation engines, and the ability to get a really cool look there. So that's all the demos that I have available. They're part of the Radiant Shapes product installation. This is my last slide, my end slide, and my contact information is listed there. As I mentioned before, the distribution of Radiant Shapes and the playlist demo has issues in Berlin, but you can get an updated version of that. Obviously, you need to have Radiant Shapes installed in order for it to work. This is just the demonstration program that uses Radiant Shapes, so the URL is listed there. And at this point, we're going to switch over to the live Q&A portion, and so I will say thank you for watching this video.
Let me ask you that question again.
Sure.
Do Radiant Shapes descend from the Firemonkey shape object?
Yes, they all the shape classes actually go up to T-shape, but there's another level that we add in called a T-radiant shape. That's the ancestor for all of them, that adds a few more properties and functions that are in the base class that aren't present in T-shape.
Okay, cool. Is the source for Radiant Shapes included with Radiant Shapes?
Yes.
Fantastic. Does Radiant Shapes work with VCL? I got a couple people asking for that one.
No, it does not. It is it's based on the FMX framework, and so it's usable in FMX, Firemonkey applications. It makes use of a lot of the base properties that are there, such as opacity and rotation angles and things like that.
Now there is actually
the VCL version would be kind of neat. It wouldn't. It would. The principle could certainly be done. Managing the shapes, the different paths. Interesting idea. There's some things you would lose because you wouldn't necessarily have them in a VCL app, or at least not easily. But from the basic shapes, sure.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you could use something like the Firemonkey container from Parnassus that would let you put embed the shapes on the Firemonkey container.
Yeah, you could, but I don't know if you'd really want to. It might be a little overkill for using the shapes, especially if you wanted to embed the shapes, say, inside of a VCL component, or and use them in multiple places.
Yeah, exactly.
Where you really want a deeper integration between the two. So, but having there is a basic shape, component that's in the VCL. I mean, it's extremely simple because it's just wrapping the couple of the GDI functions to draw a rectangle and an ellipse, but there's nothing that stops you from actually having the path support and then rendering that on your regular canvas. Things get a little bit trickier when you start talking about getting the gradient fills to work right, and just because the graphics engine and so forth are different, so you have to do a lot of clipping. You end up having to you may not get quite the good anti-aliasing when you start dealing with the points and things without switching to, say, GDI plus, or like the Firemonkey controls are normally based on the DirectX engines for their rendering. So not out of the realm of possibilities, but there would be some challenges for it.
Yeah. And I saw a comment here that you made that the animation is much smoother in real app, and I can confirm that watching from this end. It was very smooth, but GoToWebinar does its screen grabbing that does not make anything look smooth. You commented and said that on the flowchart example, you're programmatically resizing the font. Does that mean
Yes.
you have code that does that, or does the Radiant Shapes do that automatically?
The text is all, they're separate components. They're separate t-text components that are put onto each of the shapes in that example. And they're one of the things that's really cool with Firemonkey is that any control can be the parent of another control, even non-windowed controls, if you will. In the VCL, you have to have a window handle, and it has to be like a panel or a group box or something like that. So each shape has a child text control, which shows for the caption. So I didn't have a chance to show it in the video, but if you look at the demo and you open up the source code for the form, you will see that when the form resizes, there's a code that calculates the scale factor of how the form is changed, and then updates the size of the fonts for each of the text labels in the same scale factor.
Okay, that's cool. Can you style the Radiant Shapes?
Oh, that's an interesting question. No, you cannot, because the Radiant Shapes are what I call primitives. They are the base elements that you would use in a style. And so even like regular controls and the styles that are available for Firemonkey are all based on primitives. So base controls, various shapes, and other primitive controls that themselves are not stylable, but when you put them together inside of a style, can be used for other controls. So it is an example. You could very easily take the capsule shape, the Radiant capsule, which is the rectangular-like control, but with the circular sides. And you could then make a new style for an edit box. So instead of having the edit box look like a plain old rectangle, you could make it so that the border of it was the Radiant capsule, and it would have curved edges, and you would just inside the style adjust the area for the text entry. And would be a really quick way to give you a completely new look for a text box, an edit box.
Okay. There's people saying they're having trouble getting to the site here. Let me see if I can, if that works for me. Oh, Raize.com doesn't seem to be working.
Well, that's the fine. How do you do?
Yeah, I had that same problem with my. Oh, that's interesting. I can. Is maybe www? That's it. You have to put www in the front of it. Nope, still doesn't work. You get like this, it looks like a landing page or something. That's weird, because like if I go to Raize.com, the homepage, it works, but if I go to try and download the...
All right, well, I've been having some issues with my hosting provider, so try again later. After this session's over, I'll find out why the hosting provider's not routing it. So,
and then if you let me know the link, I will as well. I'll make sure that it shows up next to the replay.
Sure. It's in the end, and I know they wanted to get it there, but we can put it down and figure out what's going on with that.
Let's see. That's always great.
Oh, well, okay, hang on. It looks like, let me see here. You can ask me another question while I'm looking at this. I will resolve that issue. Okay, I believe, now I know, the site's fine. It's the link to the actual file, so I will fix that while I'm answering other questions.
Is it possible to add a caption property to the shapes?
Well, sure. You could. Let's see. If the end result is that you want to add a caption, the easy way is to actually do what the flowchart example did, which was just drop a text control onto your shape component inside of the form designer. And then you can control where that shape shows up within the confines of the base shape control. And you would treat it as a separate component. Could you add a or could a caption or a text property be added to the shape itself and actually have the shape draw the caption inside of it? Yes, you could, but typically, because these are more base primitives and you get more flexibility by having the separate text component or a label component that you use, it was something that we specifically decided not to add in, just because it would give you a little bit of functionality, but not as much as you would probably want. And if you were building up using them in a style or something along those lines, you would want the ability to style the text, meaning that you would want to give an entry point into the style definition to get to the text and the fonts of that, which is much easier to manage if it's a separate control, because when the style does its find resource, it can actually find that text control, update it appropriately, and someone can change that out. So it is a little bit different. If it was a traditional control, then yeah, you'd probably want to add that ability in there. But then you would get some restrictions for that. But because these are designed to be primitives and used in pretty much every aspect of FMX development, that was a conscious decision that it was not added to there.
That makes sense. Here's a similar question. Is it possible to use radiant shapes to align and format text along a circle? Or is this class only for geometric shapes? So could you have the text show up along the outline maybe?
Well, there's nothing in there that automatically supports that. But there is some functionality with respect to paths and inside of Firemonkey for aligning things. But I have not actually tried to how effective wrapping your text or aligning your text along a curve inside of it. I mean, I've done it in vector graphics programs, so I'm aware of what's being asked. I'm just not sure if that level of detail is there. But I believe that you would actually have to specify the path as a separate object into that and not connected to a shape. But it's possible in the future that could be something that would be a pretty cool enhancement for that.
That would be cool. And Steven's asking, hi, Steven. Nice seeing you online, by the way. He says the stars are nice, but it'd be nice to have hearts. Is it possible maybe to extend the shield component so that it is rounded like a heart?
Sure. That's one of the cool things that in developing this, excuse me, is I essentially stopped at 35, not because I ran out of shapes, but just, you got to have to pick a stopping point. But one of the things I was trying to explain in the video, especially with the shield, so I'm glad he picked up on that, is that there's any shape that we can define in a path, which is pretty much any, we could add in to the library as another pre-built path. So I fully expect down the road that more and more shapes get added into the library. Some of these common things that we see quite a bit. The heart's a great one because especially just open up any of your messaging apps and look at all of the the emoticons and emojis that are available. Many of those could certainly be made into shapes that could be added as yet another shape control. The heart's a good example. I've often thought about a lightning bolt and other types of non-traditional shapes that could be added. So certainly.
Okay, cool.
One thing I will add, one of the interesting things to consider, because you could actually do it today. If you went to a graphics program and defined a heart in Adobe Illustrator or CorelDRAW and exported that to SVG, scalable vector graphics, and then you could go into the path editor, you could open up the SVG file as text and extract out the path definition itself and get a path object that would represent what you defined. it's reasonably okay when if you end up using it. The problem you have is if you start making a lot of changes, for example, to the thickness of the stroke and things like that, that you soon run into issues, especially with points, because as you increase the thickness, it extends beyond the bounds of your rectangle. So each of the shapes inside of Radiant Shapes are smart enough to know how to adapt themselves and adjust the actual shape definition so that it constantly fits into it. So the one thing you would run into with the heart, for example, is that point. As you grew that, it would potentially be an issue. And the default behavior in the regular path component is as you increase the size of the stroke thickness, that thickness, half of that is used to shrink the area of the path. Well, that's fine if you're dealing with corners like a square or even a circle, which has no corners, and your the outermost edge for the diameter is based on the thickness of the stroke. Where you run into problems are things like triangles, and because the length of a diagonal is greater than the two sides, then you get these artifacts that show up. So inside of Radiant Shapes, there's code that accounts for all of that based on the shape. So the heart shape really would do the same thing, so you may not get quite the effect if you went and used a path.
Okay, so does Radiant Shapes use the T-path, or does it have your own implementation of a path object?
It uses a path data structure. It does not use the T-path component.
So is there it sounds like there's a lot of logic specific to each shape that talks to it about how to get bigger and smaller then? Or is that built into the...
For ones that need it for certain things, and there's a lot of, it's quite a hierarchy that's inside of the code of where, how things are related and what we can take advantage of. A lot of common code that's shared to do a lot of these calculations and handle it and be very efficient, which is one of the key things. We're dealing with floating point dimensions, and so we don't want to do extra calculations if we don't want to, and try to keep things as efficient, lightweight as possible. But yeah, it's pretty cool. The source code's there, so it is kind of interesting to see how it was structured.
Now, I know Steven's a pretty smart developer. Could he take the source code and maybe extend it to add the heart to it? Is that going to be pretty easy, you think, or?
Relatively so, I suppose.
Okay, cool. Well, all right, Steven, we're looking forward to hearing from you how that goes. All right. Well, it's top of the hour, actually just passed. So thank you so much for that session,
No problem.
Ray.